In 1944, an American train engineer vanished. 75 years later, his locomotive was found locked inside a sealed tunnel. Robert Callahan's family had been told he died a hero overseas during the war. It was a lie. When a crew finally broke through the concrete wall that had hidden his train for decades, they found something chilling. This wasn't the scene of an accident. It was a tomb. Evidence quickly surfaced, proving the tunnel was sealed intentionally, burying not just a man and his machine, but a devastating secret powerful people wanted to stay buried forever. What did this engineer discover that was so dangerous? They had to bury him alive inside a mountain. Subscribe. It helps these stories to reach people who lost hope and inspire them to keep seeking truth. Drop your city and local time in the comments. It's always fun to see our map light up. The air in the county auction house was thick with the ghosts of other people's lives. It smelled of cedar, mothballs, and the faint, sweet decay of paper and fabric giving up their hold on time. In the year 2019, Margaret Hensley, at 68 years old, found a strange comfort in these places. As a retired schoolteacher, a widow, and a grandmother, she understood that every forgotten object held a story, and she felt a quiet duty to listen. She moved past tables, piled high with chipped porcelain dolls whose painted eyes stared into nothing, stacks of yellowed Life magazines promising a future that had long since become the past, and boxes of tarnished silverware that had once been the centerpiece of 100 family dinners. These were the graveyards of memories, and Margaret was a patient mourner, looking not for value but for meaning. It was tucked away under a table, almost hidden by a stack of warped vinyl records, that she saw it. A railroad lantern. It was heavy, made of rusted, blackened steel that felt dense with history. The glass was clouded with decades of grime, and the frame was dented, as if it had been dropped or thrown in a moment of panic. Most people would have passed it by, seeing only a piece of junk. But Margaret saw something else. She saw a tool that had once cut through the blackest of nights, a beacon that had guided a colossal machine along miles of lonely track. It felt important. She paid the man $14 for it, the price of 2 movie tickets, and took it home. For the rest of the afternoon, she worked on it at her kitchen table, the familiar scent of polish and warm water filling the room. With a soft cloth, she carefully wiped away the layers of dust and neglect. The grime came away in dark streaks, revealing the solid, honest metal underneath. As the glass became clearer, a faint scratching on its surface caught the light. It wasn't a crack. It was deliberate. Letters, etched into the pane with a pin or the tip of a knife. Margaret held it up to the window, letting the late afternoon sun pour through. Her breath caught in her throat. The script was crude, but the name was unmistakable. R. Callahan. And below it, a year, 1944. The lantern nearly slipped from her hands. R. Callahan. Robert Callahan. The name echoed not from history books, but from the deepest, most shadowed corners of her own memory. It came back to her in a whisper, the sound of her mother's voice late at night, when she thought a young Margaret was asleep. "Uncle Robert," she'd said, her voice impossibly sad, "went missing in the war years." The story was a phantom in their family, a name spoken only when grief hung heavy in the air. Robert Callahan, her mother's uncle, the handsome train engineer who had signed up to do his part. The official story, the one that was sealed, stamped, and delivered in a crisp manila envelope, was that he had died a hero in combat overseas, a soldier's death. Honorable, tragic, and distant. Margaret had accepted it her entire life. It was a clean, tidy explanation for an empty chair at the dinner table. But this lantern, this heavy, rusted piece of American steel, was not from overseas. It was a domestic railroad lantern used on American freight lines. And the year scratched into the glass, 1944, was the very year he was said to have vanished while fighting in Europe. The two facts could not exist in the same world. One was a lie. A cold dread, mingled with a thrilling, terrifying sense of purpose, washed over her. The family story, the one they had carried for over 70 years, was built on sand. For a moment, Margaret felt an overwhelming wave of hope. This lantern wasn't just an object, it was a key. It was the first breadcrumb on a trail that had been cold for 3/4 of a century. She felt her uncle, the man she'd never known, reaching out from the past, asking to be found. Without thinking, she grabbed her coat and the lantern, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had to tell her brother. George was 2 years older, a retired accountant who lived his life by the numbers, a man who saw the world in columns of profit and loss. He prized stability above all else, and for George, stability meant leaving the past exactly where it was. She found him in his workshop, sanding down a piece of oak with methodical, even strokes. The air was filled with the clean, sharp smell of sawdust. "George, you have to see this," she said, her voice trembling with the magnitude of her discovery. She placed the lantern on his workbench, turning it so the light caught the scratched name. "I found this at the estate sale. Look." He switched off the sander, the sudden silence of the garage feeling loud and heavy. He squinted at the glass, his face impassive. "R. Callahan." He read aloud, his voice flat. "So what? It was a common name." "No, George, look at the year. 1944. This is for Uncle Robert. Mom told me he was a train engineer." She could hear the desperation in her own voice, the plea for him to see what she saw, to feel what she felt. George picked up his sanding block, running his thumb over the grit. He wouldn't look at her. "Margaret, Robert Callahan died in the war. He was buried in France. We have the letters." "Do we? Have you ever seen them?" She pressed. "Mom just said he was gone. But this lantern was here, in America, the year he disappeared. Don't you see? The story isn't true." A muscle in his jaw twitched. He put the sanding block down with a soft thud, and finally turned to face her, his eyes cold with a weary frustration she knew all too well. "And what if it isn't? What good does it do to go digging all this up now? It was 75 years ago. Let the man rest. Let Mom rest." His words were a physical blow. The hope that had filled her chest moments before deflated, leaving a hollow ache. "He was family, George. If they lied, we deserve to know why. We deserve peace." He shot back, his voice rising. "You're not thinking about truth, you're chasing ghosts. This family has had enough drama. You're going to stir things up, bother people, waste your time and your money on some wild goose chase, and for what? To uncover some secret that probably never existed? It's a coincidence. A name on a piece of junk." He picked up the lantern, his grip tight, and for a terrifying second she thought he might smash it against the concrete floor. Instead, he shoved it back at her. "Go home, Margaret. Don't do this. Some things are better left buried. You're going to open a door you can't close." The finality in his tone, the stark dismissal of her discovery and her feelings, shattered something between them. It was the same argument they'd had 100 times before about 100 different things. Her choice to be a teacher instead of something more practical, her refusal to sell the family house after her husband died, her insistence on remembering things he'd rather forget. He saw her as a creature of sentiment, and she saw him as a man afraid of any truth that couldn't be neatly filed away. He turned his back on her, flipping the switch on the sander. The deafening roar filled the garage, a wall of noise that said the conversation was over. Margaret stood there for a long moment, the heavy lantern in her hands, feeling utterly, profoundly alone. The crack between them, once a hairline fracture, had just split wide open. She left without another word, the sound of the sander chasing her out into the cold evening air. But his rejection did something she never expected. It didn't extinguish the fire. It fanned it into a blaze. His fear only confirmed her suspicion. If there was nothing to find, why was he so desperate for her to stop looking? That evening she drove to the cemetery. The sky was a bruised purple, and a cold wind whispered through the ancient oak trees, rattling the last of their dry leaves. She stopped at her mother's grave, the granite cool and solid beneath her fingertips. For a long time she just stood there, letting the silence of the place settle over her. She thought of her mother's sad stories, of George's angry warnings, and of the ghost named Robert Callahan. She placed the old rusted lantern at the base of the headstone, its dark metal a stark contrast to the polished stone. It looked like an offering, an anchor to a past they had tried to erase. "Mom," she whispered, her voice tight with emotion, the words forming puffs of white in the cold air. "They lied to you. They lied to all of us." She took a deep, shuddering breath, the vow forming in her heart before it ever reached her lips. A promise made not to the dead, but to the truth itself. "I don't know where this will lead, but I'm going to find out. I swear it. I'll find out what really happened to him." The wind picked up, howling softly, as if in answer. She had just opened a door, as George had warned. And as she stood there, shivering in the descending darkness, she had no idea what was waiting for her on the other side. The town library wasn't a place of quiet contemplation for Margaret. It was an armory. Its weapons were facts, stored on miles of microfilm and bound in heavy, crumbling archives that smelled of dust and time itself. The day after her confrontation with George, she walked through its hushed aisles not as a retired schoolteacher, but as a soldier preparing for a long and lonely war. The fight with her brother had left a deep, cold wound, but it had also forged her resolve into something hard and unyielding. He thought she was chasing ghosts. Fine, she would bring him back a body. In the basement, where the local history section was kept, the air grew cooler, the silence more profound. She requested the newspaper archives for the year 1944. The librarian, a young man with kind eyes, brought out a massive leather-bound volume that looked like an ancient spellbook. Its pages were brittle, the color of old ivory, and they flaked at the edges as she turned them. Her fingers, stained with a faint trace of newsprint, moved slowly, scanning the headlines. The world was at war. Every column screamed of battles in the Pacific, advances in Europe, rationing at home. It was a world of black and white certainties, of good versus evil, and it felt a universe away from her own quiet life. For hours, she saw nothing. Her hope began to fray. George's voice echoed in her mind. A waste of time, a wild goose chase. The disappointment was a physical weight on her shoulders. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps the lantern was just a meaningless coincidence, a cruel trick of fate. She was about to give up, her eyes aching from the strain, when a small headline on an inside page snagged her attention. It was from the autumn of that year. "Freight train lost in Allegheny foothills." Her breath hitched. Her heart began to beat a frantic, hopeful rhythm. With trembling hands, she read the short article. It was just a few paragraphs, buried between an advertisement for war bonds and a local farm report. The prose was stark, efficient. A freight train, owned by the Allegheny and Eastern Rail Company, had been reported lost during a severe storm. Due to the rugged terrain and the wartime priority of keeping the main lines open, recovery efforts were deemed impractical. The incident was officially ruled an industrial accident caused by equipment failure. And then, the sentence that made the air go thin and cold around her: there were no survivors. No survivors. Margaret read the words again and again. It was a clean, tragic end. But it didn't feel right. It was too neat, too simple. Her teacher's instinct, honed by decades of spotting the flaw in a student's logic, screamed at her. She forced herself to scan the rest of the page, her eyes darting over every word, and then she saw it. Tucked away in a small box near the bottom, under the heading "Community Notices," was a list. It was a notice from the railroad company itself, naming the crew members who had been accounted for and had returned home safely after the accident. There were 4 names listed, 4 survivors. Her mind reeled. The article said, "No survivors," but the company's own notice listed 4. Both could not be true. The newspaper was lying, or the railroad was. And then she saw the final line at the bottom of the notice. It was a single, stark sentence. "One crewman remains unaccounted for, Engineer Robert Callahan." The book slipped from her grasp and hit the table with a heavy thud. It was real. It was all real. Robert wasn't in Europe. He was here, in the Allegheny Mountains, at the helm of a train that had been deliberately erased from history. A surge of validation, so powerful it almost made her dizzy, coursed through her. This wasn't a ghost story. This was a cover-up. She felt a presence beside her and looked up, startled. An older man, tall and immaculately dressed in a tweed jacket, was standing there, looking down at the open archive. He had silver hair and a face that was handsome in a severe, authoritative way. He smiled, but it didn't reach his cool blue eyes. "Fascinating history, isn't it?" he said, his voice smooth and deep. "The old rail lines built this town." Margaret, still shaken, simply nodded, her hand instinctively closing over the article as if to protect it. "I'm Elliot Grant," he said, extending a hand. "My family has been involved with the Historical Society for generations. I couldn't help but notice your interest in the A&E line." "Margaret Hensley," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't want to talk to him. She didn't want to share this. "I was just looking into some family history." Grant's eyes flickered down to the page, and for a fleeting moment she was certain he knew exactly what she was reading. His smile tightened. "Of course, a noble pursuit. But a word of friendly advice," he said, leaning in just slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "Some tunnels are sealed for a reason. Best let the dead rest." The words, so similar to her brother's, hit her with the force of a physical blow. It was a warning. It was a threat. Before she could respond, he straightened up, gave her a polite nod, and walked away, disappearing into the stacks. Margaret sat there, her heart pounding in her ears. Who was that man? And how could he possibly know what she was looking for? The initial joy of her discovery was now poisoned with fear. The ghost she was chasing suddenly had a face, a powerful, watchful presence that had just put her on notice. That evening, filled with a new sense of urgency, she composed an email. She found the corporate successor to the Allegheny and Eastern Line online, a massive logistics conglomerate with a slick, impersonal website. Trying to sound professional and detached, she requested any and all employment and incident records pertaining to one Robert Callahan from 1944, citing genealogical research. Then, she waited. The wait was excruciating. Every creak of the old house, every shadow that moved outside her window, felt menacing. Elliot Grant's words echoed in her mind. Some tunnels are sealed for a reason. 2 days later, the reply landed in her inbox. It was not from a person, but from a legal department. The language was cold, dense with corporate jargon and veiled threats. "Dear Miss Hensley," it began, "due to the historical nature of your request and prevailing liability concerns, we are unable to release the records you have specified. The company considers all personnel and accident files from that era to be confidential and proprietary." It was a door slamming shut in her face. A solid steel wall of institutional power. The feeling of being a small, old woman against a giant, faceless entity was crushing. All her momentum, all her fierce determination, evaporated, leaving behind a bitter residue of impotence and despair. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the screen, feeling the full weight of the 75 years that stood between her and the truth. George was right. The company was hiding something, and they had armies of lawyers to make sure it stayed hidden forever. She was about to close her laptop and surrender when she heard a knock at the door. It was her granddaughter, Claire, home from college for the weekend, her arms full of groceries and her face full of life. Claire took one look at her grandmother's defeated expression and the papers spread across the table and knew something was wrong. Margaret explained everything: the lantern, the article, the lie, the man in the library, the soul-crushing email from the railroad. She expected Claire to be sympathetic, to tell her she'd done her best and it was time to let it go. Instead, Claire's eyes lit up with a fire Margaret hadn't seen in herself for 50 years. "Grandma, this is incredible," she said, pulling up a chair. "They're stonewalling you because they're scared. Liability concerns. That's what people say when they're hiding something big." The defeat in Margaret's chest began to recede, replaced by the warmth of her granddaughter's unwavering belief. "But what can I do?" Margaret asked, her voice weary. "They're a massive corporation. I'm just me." Claire leaned forward, her expression fierce and determined. "No, you're not just you. We're a team. You have the story, I have the technology. We'll find another way in. We'll dig through public records, land deeds, maybe find other railroad employees' families. We'll build a case they can't ignore." She reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. You always told me that the truth matters more than convenience. You taught me to never back down just because a fight is hard." Claire squeezed her hand, her eyes shining. Maybe that's what he believed too, Uncle Robert. Maybe he was fighting for something, and now it's our turn. In that moment, holding her granddaughter's hand, Margaret felt a surge of hope so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore. The ghost had a name, the cover-up had a trail, and now, the chase had a partner. That night, after Claire had gone home, Margaret stood by her living room window, looking out into the darkness. She felt stronger, more determined than ever. The road ahead was long and dangerous, but for the first time, she believed she could walk it. And then, a sound. The distinct crunch of tires on the gravel of her driveway. Headlights swept across her living room wall and then vanished. Peeking through the curtains, she saw a dark sedan she didn't recognize, parked at the end of her drive, its engine off, sitting in total darkness. Her blood ran cold. It could be nothing. A lost driver. A neighbor's visitor. But in the pit of her stomach, she knew it wasn't. She thought of Elliot Grant's cold eyes, the railroad's legalistic threats. She backed away from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. They knew. Somehow, they already knew. And they were watching her. Sleep did not come easily that night. The image of the dark sedan was burned into Margaret's mind, a silent, predatory shape lurking just beyond the halo of her porch light. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep on gravel, every creak of the old house a turning doorknob. This was no longer just a quest for historical truth. A line had been crossed. The past had reached out and touched her, and its grip felt cold and menacing. The fear was a living thing, a coiled snake in her gut. It whispered to her in George's voice, "You're making us a target for things better left buried." But beneath the fear, a different emotion was stirring, anger, a slow-burning, defiant rage. Who were these people? Who was Elliot Grant? And what right did they have to stand between a family and its own history, to guard a 75-year-old secret with silent threats in the dead of night? By morning, the anger had burned away the fear. She was a 68-year-old woman. She had buried a husband, raised 2 children, and taught American history to generations of students. She would not be intimidated by shadows. She had a new plan, born of sleepless defiance. If Elliot Grant was the town's self-appointed guardian of history, then she would approach him as such. She wouldn't accuse. She would consult. She would walk straight into the lion's den and ask the lion for a tour. The Grant family name was practically etched onto the town itself. The Grant Memorial Library, Grant Park, Grant Avenue. His office was in the heart of the Historical Society, a stately brick building that smelled of floor wax and old money. The room was less of an office and more of a personal museum. Glass cabinets displayed Civil War medals and yellowed photographs of stern-faced men in bowler hats. The walls were lined with leather-bound books, their spines perfectly aligned. It was a room that radiated order, control, and a history that had been carefully curated and approved. Elliot Grant rose from behind a massive mahogany desk as she entered, his smile as polished and insincere as the day before. He was 74, she learned, a retired railroad safety inspector. A chill went down her spine. A safety inspector. "Mrs. Hensley," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "An unexpected pleasure. What can I do for you?" "Mr. Grant," Margaret began, forcing a calm she did not feel. "You mentioned your family's deep connection to this town's history. I was hoping you might be able to help me. I'm researching an ancestor who worked for the Allegheny and Eastern Line around 1944. His eyes, the color of a frozen lake, held hers. There was not a flicker of surprise in them. He knew exactly why she was here. "An honorable endeavor," he said, gesturing for her to sit in a stiff leather chair that felt more like an interrogation seat than a visitor's chair. "It's important to remember the men who built this country." What was his name? Robert Callahan. He was an engineer. She watched his face for any reaction, any tell, but there was nothing. He was a fortress. Callahan, he mused, tapping a long, elegant finger on his desk blotter. The name doesn't immediately ring a bell. 1944 was a chaotic time, you understand. The war effort took precedence over everything. Records were lost, incidents were streamlined for the sake of morale and national security. The word streamlined hung in the air, cold and ugly. He was explaining the cover-up to her, dressing it up in the noble robes of patriotism. A wave of disgust washed over her. He continued, his tone patient, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. The Allegheny Line was vital for moving steel and munitions. The government put immense pressure on them to keep the trains running, no matter the cost. Men worked double, triple shifts. Equipment was pushed past its limits. It was a dangerous time. He paused, his gaze intensifying. Sometimes, for the greater good, tragic things must be accepted, put aside, for the good of the community, for the war, for the sake of order. There it was again, that reverence for order. It was more than a preference, it was a doctrine. I understand that, Margaret said, her voice tight. But the article I found was contradictory. It said there were no survivors of an accident, but the company's own notice listed 4. Grant gave a small, condescending sigh. Newspaper reports from that era were notoriously unreliable, Mrs. Hensley. Confusion is understandable. I'd advise you not to put too much faith in them. Then he did something that completely disarmed her. He smiled, a genuine seeming smile this time, and stood up. He walked over to a large, wood-framed map hanging on the wall. But your search is not entirely hopeless. The old mountain lines are a passion of mine. He opened a drawer in a map cabinet and pulled out a rolled yellow document. This is a topographical survey of the Allegheny rail tunnels from the 1940s. It shows all the lines, including the auxiliary routes that were decommissioned after the war. Perhaps it can offer you a sense of direction. He unrolled it on his desk. It was beautiful, hand-drawn, detailing every curve and grade of the mountain pass. And on it, marked with faded ink, were the names of dozens of tunnels. She felt a jolt of pure, unadulterated hope. This was it. This was the key. He was helping her. Maybe she had misjudged him. As he handed it over, their fingers brushed. His hand was cool, dry. He was holding a silver pen, and as he spoke, he began to tap it lightly against his teeth. A quick, repetitive clicking sound. Click, click, click. Just be careful, he said, his voice dropping low again. Those mountains are treacherous, full of sealed shafts and unstable ground. He looked her directly in the eyes, the avuncular mask dropping for a split second to reveal something hard and cold beneath. You wouldn't want to get lost chasing a ghost. He held her gaze for a moment longer, then smiled again, the mask back in place. While he re-rolled the map, he muttered something so quietly she almost didn't catch it, a soft hiss under his breath. Order before truth. The phrase hit her with the force of an electric shock. Order before truth. It was his creed, his justification. She had found his tell, the crack in his perfect, polished armor. He wasn't helping her. He was playing with her. He was giving her a map to a maze he had designed, confident that she would get lost inside it. She left his office with the map clutched in her hand, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The feeling of being watched was no longer a suspicion. It was a certainty. She felt his eyes on her back as she walked down the street. As soon as she got home, she locked the door and called Claire. She needed to share the burden of this fear. "Claire, honey, I need you to listen to me very carefully," she said, her voice shaking. "This is getting complicated. If you're going to help me, we need some rules. I want you to text me your location every time you go somewhere to do research for this. Don't go alone, ever. And you carry a flashlight and your phone with you at all times, fully charged. Do you understand me? This is not a game." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then Claire's voice, serious and firm. "I understand, Grandma. We'll be careful. We'll be smart." The conversation gave Margaret a small measure of relief. It was the simple, practical act of protecting her family. She had modeled safety, turning her fear into a shield. Feeling a renewed sense of purpose, she took the precious map out to the small, detached shed in her backyard that she used as a study. It was her sanctuary, filled with her notes, books, and the old railroad lantern sitting on her desk like a holy relic. She carefully unrolled the map, tacking its corners to a large corkboard. Staring at the web of lines, she felt the thrill of the hunt return. She would beat him at his own game. She would find the sealed tunnel, The work was engrossing. For the next hour, she cross-referenced the map with her newspaper clippings, making notes, circling possible locations. She felt focused, empowered. The fear receded. She decided to go inside and make a cup of tea. She was only gone for 10 minutes. When she returned to the shed, the door was slightly ajar. She knew with absolute gut-wrenching certainty that she had closed it. Her hand trembled as she pushed it open. The sight that met her eyes stole the air from her lungs. Her sanctuary had been desecrated. Her notes were strewn across the floor, trampled and torn. Books had been swept from their shelves. Her neat, orderly research had been reduced to chaos. It was a whirlwind of violation, a physical manifestation of Grant's contempt. And then she saw the map. It was still tacked to the board, but a single jagged tear ran right through the heart of the Allegheny Mountains, ripping through the very section she had been studying. It was a deliberate, violent message. It said, "I gave this to you, and I can take it away. I can get to you any time I want." The lantern was untouched, sitting on the desk amidst the wreckage. She stumbled toward it, her legs feeling weak. This was no longer a story from the past. It was here, now, in her yard, in her life. The cold, calculated cruelty of it was breathtaking. She stood there, trembling in the ruins of her work, the torn map a testament to the enemy she had just made. And she knew, with a chilling certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was only the beginning. Standing in the wreckage of her small shed, Margaret Hensley made a decision. She would not call the police. The act of vandalism was so precise, so targeted, that she knew with a sickening certainty it would be dismissed as teenage mischief. There was no broken lock, no overt sign of forced entry, just a door left carelessly ajar. They would see a messy shed, not a message. Elliot Grant was too smart, too practiced in the art of intimidation without leaving fingerprints. To report this would be to show her hand, to reveal her fear, and Margaret was done being afraid. Instead, she knelt on the dusty floor and began to pick up the scattered pieces of her research, her movements slow and deliberate. She would not let this violation stop her. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with something harder, more resolute. It was the quiet, stubborn courage of a teacher who has seen a bully try to terrorize the playground one too many times. She spent the rest of the day meticulously taping the torn map back together, the jagged rip a scar that now seemed more like a battle wound than an act of desecration. That evening, Claire came over. She walked into the shed, saw the repaired map on the wall and the organized stacks of notes on the desk, and a slow, admiring smile spread across her face. "Wow," she said softly. "He really tried to shut you down." "He failed," Margaret said, her voice firm. There was a new partnership between them now, forged in the face of a common enemy. It wasn't just about history anymore. It was about defiance. Together they studied the mended map, tracing the faded lines with their fingertips. The torn section ran through a cluster of auxiliary lines in the most remote part of the Allegheny foothills. It was a spiderweb of tracks leading into the dense, unforgiving wilderness. "He didn't want you looking here," Claire whispered, her finger hovering over a specific spur line that ended abruptly at the side of a mountain marked on the map as Black Ridge. "This has to be it." The decision was made without another word. They had to go. They had to see it for themselves. 2 days later, they set out. Margaret had insisted on a Saturday, a bright, clear autumn day that felt deceptively cheerful. She packed a bag with water, first aid supplies and flashlights, the safety rules she'd imposed on Claire, now a ritual that gave her a small illusion of control. The drive into the mountains was a journey back in time. The highways gave way to winding country roads and then to gravel tracks that were barely more than scars on the landscape. The trees closed in around them, a riot of orange, red, and gold that felt beautiful but also suffocating. The air grew cooler, smelling of damp earth and decaying leaves. They left the car where the gravel road dissolved into an impassable, overgrown trail. The silence here was absolute, broken only by the rustle of the wind and the crunch of their boots on the fallen leaves. Following the faint impression of where the old rail line used to be, they walked deeper into the forest. For over an hour, They saw nothing but trees and shadows. A creeping sense of doubt began to settle over Margaret. What if they were wrong? What if she had dragged her granddaughter out into this wilderness on a fool's errand, chasing a phantom from a torn map? The thought was disheartening, a small victory for Elliot Grant and his campaign of fear. And then, Claire stopped dead. "Grandma, look!" Through a thicket of tangled rhododendron, something unnatural poked through the undergrowth. A long, straight line of rusted metal, nearly swallowed by the forest floor. It was a rail. They scrambled through the bushes, their jackets snagging on thorns, and found themselves standing on the remnants of the old spur line. It was like discovering the bones of a long-extinct creature. Most of the ties had rotted away, but the two parallel lines of steel remained, a ghostly track leading into the deep woods. A surge of triumph, pure and thrilling, shot through Margaret. They had found it. The feeling was electric, a jolt of hope that chased away the exhaustion and the fear. They followed the tracks, their pace quickening with anticipation. The line curved around the base of the mountain, and then they saw it. It was so perfectly camouflaged by time and nature that they almost missed it. A flat, unnatural wall of gray stood between two outcroppings of rock. It was a solid slab of concrete, at least 20 feet high and 30 feet wide, rough and streaked with water stains. And disappearing right into the base of it were the two steel rails. It was the tunnel, sealed. Margaret reached out and touched the cold, hard surface. It was real. It was exactly as she had imagined, a massive, brutal plug stopping up the mouth of the mountain. This was not a natural rock slide. This was a deliberate act. This was a tombstone. They stood there in silence for a long time, the sheer, undeniable reality of it washing over them. Robert Callahan's journey had ended right here. In the dirt at the base of the concrete wall, half buried under a carpet of leaves, Margaret saw a glint of metal. She knelt down, her old knees protesting, and brushed the debris away. Her fingers closed around a small, heavy object. It was a train whistle, the kind conductors used. It was made of brass, now green and pitted with age, but stamped into the metal, faint but still legible, was a small C and the number 1944. C for Callahan, her uncle's whistle. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes as she clutched the small piece of metal. It was a tangible link, a voice from the past. He had stood on this very spot. He had likely dropped this in the chaos of whatever had happened here. The emotional weight of the discovery was immense. It was proof. It was vindication. The joy and sorrow were so intertwined it was impossible to separate them. They had found the place, but in doing so, they had found the stark reality of his end. The feeling of hope was immediately followed by a profound sense of loss. That evening, buoyed by their discovery, Margaret made a call to the head of the local historical society, a woman named Mrs. Albright. She laid out the story, her voice steady and confident, backed by the undeniable evidence of the sealed tunnel and the whistle. To her immense relief, Mrs. Albright listened not with skepticism, but with a growing sense of scholarly excitement. This was not just a family story. It was a significant piece of local history, hidden for decades. She agreed to help. The Historical Society had legal standing and community influence. They would file a petition with the county to have the site declared a historical landmark and request a permit for an exploratory excavation. For the first time, Margaret felt she had a powerful ally. The system, which had seemed so impenetrable, was now potentially on her side. A week later, the response came. The County Planning Commission had denied the permit. The official reason, stated in dry, bureaucratic language, was that the site posed significant and unassessed safety hazards, and that any attempt at excavation would be fiscally irresponsible. The words were a flimsy excuse, a smokescreen. Margaret knew with every fiber of her being that this was Elliot Grant's handiwork. He was a retired safety inspector. He knew the language, the procedures, the people. He had quietly poisoned the well, using his influence and the town's fear of liability to shut her down. The rage that filled her was a white-hot fury. He hadn't just defeated her. He had used the very mechanisms of civic order, the rules and regulations she respected, as a weapon against her. It was a perversion of the system, an act of such profound, cynical manipulation that it left her breathless. He had let her find the tunnel, let her taste victory, only to snatch it away at the last second, leaving her with nothing but a worthless petition and a heart full of impotent anger. The setback was devastating, a plunge from the peak of hope into the abyss of despair. She was back to square one. Only this time, the door wasn't just closed. It was padlocked and guarded by the full weight of county authority. She sat at her kitchen table, the denied permit on the table in front of her. The official county seal seemed to mock her. The fight felt impossible again. She was an old woman with a story, and he was the system itself. How could she possibly win? The phone rang, startling her. It was Claire, her voice low and urgent. "Grandma," she said, "I think you need to come home. Now." "What is it? Are you okay?" Margaret asked, her heart leaping into her throat. "I'm fine, but someone's been here." Margaret's blood ran cold. She drove the 10 minutes to Claire's off-campus apartment in a state of sheer terror. She found her granddaughter standing in her small living room, pale but composed. The room was untouched, nothing like the chaos of the shed. "What happened?" Margaret demanded, her eyes scanning for any sign of danger. Claire pointed to her laptop, which was sitting open on her desk. "I was at the library," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I came back, and my laptop was open. I always close it. Always." Margaret looked at the screen. The search history was displayed. All of the articles, land deeds, and corporate records they had been researching had been deleted. Every digital breadcrumb was gone. And in the center of the screen, a single new text document had been left open. It contained only 5 words. "Let the dead rest, Margaret. Let the dead rest, Margaret." The words on Claire's laptop screen were not just a threat, they were a violation of the deepest kind. Tearing up her shed was one thing. It was an attack on her space, her research. But this was different. This was an invasion into her granddaughter's life. They had crossed a sacred line. Elliot Grant, or whoever was working for him, had entered Claire's home, laid hands on her personal property, and left a message that was dripping with malice. The rage Margaret felt was no longer a slow burn, it was a consuming fire. The visceral, protective instinct of a grandmother surged through her, eclipsing every last trace of fear. He had made a grave mistake. He had made it personal. Standing in Claire's apartment, Margaret's first impulse was to scoop her granddaughter up and hide her away, to tell her to stop, that it was too dangerous. But then she looked at Claire's face. The initial shock had faded, replaced by the same hard, defiant anger that was coursing through Margaret's own veins. "He thinks this will scare us off," Claire said, her voice dangerously quiet. "He thinks we're just a couple of harmless women, an old lady and a college kid. He's about to find out how wrong he is," Margaret replied, her voice a low growl. The escalation forced a change in strategy. They could no longer afford to work in the shadows. The system, the county permits, the corporate legal departments, was Grant's territory. He owned it. So, Margaret decided to move the battle to her territory, the court of public opinion. As a retired teacher, she still held a measure of respect and trust in the community. She arranged to give a small talk at the public library, under the guise of a local history presentation. She titled it, "The Lost Rails of Allegheny County, A Story of Wartime Sacrifice." It was a deliberately neutral title, designed to attract the curious without sounding accusatory. She had to make a choice. A reckless, desperate decision. She knew Grant would be watching. He might even be there. Part of her, the cautious, sensible part, screamed that this was foolish, that she was painting a target on her own back. But the angrier, more desperate part of her knew that staying silent was no longer an option. Silence was surrender. So she decided not to just present the facts, but to lay a trap. The night of the talk, the library's community room was half full, mostly with retirees and local history buffs. As she expected, Elliot Grant was there, sitting in the back row, his posture relaxed, his expression one of polite academic interest. He looked like a king observing his court, confident that no one would dare challenge his reign. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she stepped up to the podium. She began her talk by speaking of the immense pressures of the war, the heroism of the men who worked the rails, the arteries that kept the nation's heart beating. She spoke with the passion and clarity of a lifelong educator, drawing her audience in. Then, carefully, she began to introduce the mystery. She spoke of a freight train that vanished, of an industrial accident with conflicting reports. She held up a picture of the sealed tunnel. Gasps rippled through the small crowd. But she did not mention Robert Callahan's name. She did not make it personal. Instead, she framed it as an unsolved piece of local history, a puzzle that the community deserved to understand. And then she laid her trap. "It's been suggested," she said, her voice steady, "that the pressures of wartime sometimes led to compromises in safety. That perhaps men were asked to run trains they knew were not fit for the tracks. We may never know if that was the case here." She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. But one wonders what a man of principle would do in such a situation. A man who put safety and the truth above all else. She let her eyes sweep the room, and for a fraction of a second they met Elliot Grant's. His polite smile was gone. His face was a mask of cold fury. He knew she was talking about him, about his professed role as a safety inspector, about his creed of order over truth. She had turned his own history against him. After the talk, as people milled about, a man approached her. He was old, frail, leaning heavily on a cane, his face a roadmap of wrinkles. He wore a veteran's cap. "Ma'am," he began, his voice raspy with age, "I was just a kid back then, but my father was a yardman for the A&E line during the war. He didn't talk much about it, said it was bad luck. But I heard things." "Hush talk." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of talk?" "About an engineer," the old man said, lowering his voice. "A fella who raised a stink, said the company was running trains with cracked wheels, pushing engines that were due for the scrap heap. To meet wartime quotas, you see. This engineer, he refused to drive one, said it was a death trap." A wave of dizzying clarity washed over Margaret. It all clicked into place. The lie about his death overseas, the sealed tunnel, the corporate stonewalling. Robert wasn't the victim of a random accident. He was a whistleblower, and he had been silenced. "Do you remember his name?" she asked, her voice trembling. The old man shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. They buried the story pretty deep. Called the fella a traitor for holding up the war effort. But Margaret knew. The lantern, the whistle, the sealed tunnel, they all screamed his name. Robert Callahan wasn't a victim. He was a hero. And they hadn't just buried him, they had murdered his reputation. The revelation was a staggering emotional peak, a moment of profound, terrible validation. The joy of knowing her uncle's true character was immediately crushed by the horror of what had been done to him. Driving home, the euphoria and the horror warred within her. The rain started to fall, a light drizzle that quickly turned into a blinding downpour. The wipers struggled to keep up, smearing the water across the windshield. The country road was dark and slick. As she rounded a sharp curve at the base of a hill, her headlights caught a flicker of movement. A deer. She slammed on the brakes. The pedal went straight to the floor. There was a horrifying, spongy nothingness where the resistance should have been. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. The car wasn't slowing down. It was hydroplaning, sliding sideways on the wet asphalt, hurtling toward a thick grove of trees at the edge of the road. She yanked the steering wheel, trying to correct the skid, her knuckles white. Time seemed to stretch and distort. She saw the rough bark of the trees, the slick wetness of the leaves, the impending shatter of glass and crunch of metal. In that terrifying, elongated second, one thought screamed through her mind. Elliot. He had been at the library. He had heard her challenge. This was his answer. The car spun, the tires finally catching on the gravel shoulder. With a sickening lurch, it slammed backward into a muddy embankment, the rear bumper crumpling with a loud metallic groan. The engine stalled. Silence descended, broken only by the drumming of the rain on the roof and the frantic, ragged sound of her own breathing. She sat there for a long time, her hands shaking so violently she couldn't release her grip on the steering wheel. It wasn't an accident. She knew it with the same bone-deep certainty that she knew her own name. Later, at the garage, the mechanic would confirm it. "Ma'am, you're lucky to be alive," he'd said, his face grim as he held up a severed hose. "Your brake line was cut. Clean through. This wasn't a blowout. Someone did this." The descent from the emotional high of her discovery to this new, terrifying low was dizzying. The game had changed again. They were no longer just trying to scare her. They had tried to kill her. That night, her brother George showed up at her door, his face pale with a mixture of fear and anger. Someone from the garage must have called him. "What have you done, Margaret?" he demanded, his voice shaking with fury. "I told you to leave it alone. I told you. A brake line? Are you insane? You're going to get yourself killed. They're covering up a murder, George," she yelled back, her own control finally snapping. "They killed him. They killed Uncle Robert, and now they're trying to kill me." "And for what?" he shouted, his face inches from hers. "For some 75-year-old secret that no one cares about? You're not just risking your own life. You're endangering this whole family. You're making us a target. Claire's picture is in the paper, with you, at that library event. Did you ever stop to think about her?" The accusation hit her like a punch to the gut. The image of the violated laptop, the threat addressed to her but left in Claire's home, flashed in her mind. Had her quest for justice put her own granddaughter in the crosshairs? The thought was a dagger in her heart. This was her lowest point, a pit of despair and self-doubt so deep she wasn't sure she could climb out. Her brother, the one person who should have been her staunchest ally, now looked at her with contempt. The community she had tried to rally felt distant and abstract, and the enemy she was fighting had just proven he would stop at nothing. She had won a small battle at the library, but in doing so, she had provoked a war she was terrifyingly unprepared to fight. Her victory had turned to ash in her mouth, and the truth she so desperately sought now seemed more distant and deadly than ever. George's accusation hung in the air between them, heavier and more damaging than any physical blow. "Did you ever stop to think about her?" The words echoed in the hollow space inside Margaret's chest, a devastating chorus of her own deepest fears. The confrontation with her brother, combined with the near-fatal crash, had shattered her resolve. The fury was gone, replaced by a cold, numbing despair. He was right. Her pursuit of a long-dead uncle was putting the living at risk. Her granddaughter, the thought was unbearable. For 2 days, she did nothing. She didn't answer Claire's calls. She unplugged her phone and sat in the quiet of her house, the silence a heavy shroud. The artifacts of her quest, the lantern, the whistle, the taped-up map, seemed to mock her from their places in her study. They were symbols not of a noble search for truth, but of a foolish and dangerous obsession. She was ready to quit. The cost had become too high. The fight was too great. Let the dead rest. Let Elliot Grant have his victory. It didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was keeping Claire safe. She was staring out the window, watching the rain fall in gray, joyless sheets, when a car pulled into her driveway. It was Claire. Her heart sank. She didn't want to face her, didn't want to see the disappointment in her eyes when she told her it was over. But Claire wasn't coming to ask about their next move. She was holding a large, dusty book, her face alight with an excitement so intense it seemed to push back against the gloom of the day. "Grandma, you are not going to believe this," she said, bursting through the door and shaking the rain from her coat. She didn't even seem to notice Margaret's despondent state. "I couldn't stop thinking about what that old veteran said, about them calling Uncle Robert a traitor. It didn't make sense. So I started thinking, where would people in 1944 hide things they didn't want anyone to find, but that they also couldn't bear to destroy?" She didn't wait for an answer. "The church. People gave things to the church for safekeeping. Old family Bibles, records, donations." Margaret stared at her blankly. "Our old church street." "Jude's. They were doing a clear-out of the old parish hall, getting rid of stuff before a renovation. I volunteered to help, and I found this." She placed the heavy, leather-bound book on the kitchen table. It was an old donation ledger, its pages warped and water-stained. It lists all the big donations from the 1930s and 40s, pews, windows, and this. She flipped to a page near the back, her finger tracing a line of elegant, faded cursive. Look. In memory of the Allegheny and Eastern Rail Workers, a donation from the company, 1 charity collection box, 1947. Margaret leaned in, her curiosity stirring despite her despair. A collection box? Why would that be important? Because, Claire said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, the box itself was the donation. It was one of those big, heavy oak ones. The pastor said it sat in the narthex for 50 years until they replaced it. He let me look inside before they threw it out. And taped to the bottom, hidden underneath the felt lining, I found this. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thin, smaller ledger, its cover plain and unmarked. She opened it. The pages were filled with columns of names and numbers. Margaret's eyes scanned the list. They were the names of railroad men. Beside each name was a dollar amount. The heading at the top of the page read, Hazard and Compliance Bonuses, 1944. It was a list of payoffs, bribes, money paid to men to get them to run unsafe trains and keep quiet about it. And then her breath caught. Near the bottom of the list was his name, Robert Callahan. But beside it, where a dollar amount should have been, 2 words were scrawled in angry, decisive ink, Refused payment. There it was. The proof. The black and white, undeniable evidence of his character, of his courage. He had refused their hush money. He had chosen principle over profit, safety over silence. He wasn't just a victim. He was a resistor. The discovery was like a lightning strike to Margaret's soul. The despair, the fear, the doubt, it was all burned away in an instant, replaced by a surge of fierce, protective love for the man she had never known. This ledger was his voice, speaking across the decades, telling her not to give up. He hadn't given up. How could she? The hope was so powerful, so absolute, it felt like a physical force. She was closer than she had ever been. She looked at Claire, her eyes shining with unshed tears. You found it, she whispered. Oh, Claire, you found it. At that very moment, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the house. It was a knock that carried no warmth, only demand. Margaret's heart plummeted. She and Claire exchanged a look of pure dread. Through the frosted glass of the front door, she could see the silhouette of a tall, broad-shouldered man, Elliot Grant. She opened the door. He stood on her porch, impeccably dressed despite the rain, an umbrella held over his head. His smile was gone. His face was a mask of cold, barely contained rage. Mrs. Hensley, he said, his voice clipped and hard. We need to talk. He didn't wait for an invitation, stepping past her into the entryway, his eyes immediately falling on the ledgers sitting on the kitchen table. His gaze hardened. I had hoped our last conversation would be sufficient, he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing tone. I had hoped you were a woman who understood when a line should not be crossed. Clearly, I was mistaken. What do you want? Margaret asked, her voice trembling but defiant. She moved to stand slightly in front of Claire. I am here to deliver a final warning, he said, taking a step closer. The scent of his expensive cologne and the damp wool of his overcoat filled the small space. It felt suffocating. This obsession of yours ends now. You will cease all inquiries. You will stop talking to people. You will forget you ever found that tunnel. He leaned in, his voice a venomous whisper. If you do not, I will be forced to take measures. I have friends in the county sheriff's office. A simple complaint about trespassing, about harassment. It would be very easy to have you arrested, to see you publicly disgraced. He paused, then let his cold eyes drift to Claire. And it would be a terrible shame if your bright young granddaughter were to find her academic career complicated by a police record. Reputations once tarnished are so very difficult to clean. The threat was breathtaking in its cruelty. It was a direct, vicious attack on Claire's future. The rage inside Margaret was so immense she felt like she might choke on it. And then, he brought the silver pen out of his jacket pocket. He started to tap it against his teeth. Click, click, click. The sound was like a rattlesnake's warning. It was the sound of his agitation, his loss of control. He was rattled. He was scared of what she had found, of what she might find next. He turned to leave, pausing at the door. "This is your only warning, Margaret. Order will be maintained." And then he was gone, leaving a profound and terrifying silence in his wake. Margaret sank into a chair, her legs trembling. The plunge from the ecstatic high of their discovery into this pit of raw personal threat was sickening. He had threatened to ruin her granddaughter's life. The line between right and wrong had never been clearer, and the stakes had never been higher. That night, sleep was impossible. Margaret and Claire sat in the living room, a pot of tea between them, the house locked down tight. They didn't speak much, but their shared presence was a comfort, a small island of warmth in a sea of fear. The quiet intimacy of the moment was heavy with unspoken anxieties. Finally, Margaret looked at her granddaughter, her heart aching. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Not for me. For you." She took a deep breath, the confession feeling like a physical weight being lifted. "I'm 68 years old, Claire. I've lived my life. But this might be a fight I don't live to see the end of. Maybe your Uncle George is right. Maybe I should stop." Claire reached out and took her grandmother's hand, her grip strong and steady. "No," she said, her voice fierce. "We can't stop. Not now. That's what he wants. We are going to see this through, Grandma, together." She looked at Margaret, her eyes full of a love and resolve that mirrored Margaret's own. "He may not have known your name, but Uncle Robert was fighting for people like you. For people who believe the truth is worth fighting for. We can't let him down." In the quiet of the night, holding her granddaughter's hand, Margaret made a silent vow. Elliot Grant could threaten her. He could try to hurt her, but he could not stop her. This was no longer just for Robert, it was for Claire, it was for the future. The truth would come out, no matter the cost. Elliot Grant's visit was an act of desperation, and desperation leaves cracks. Margaret knew it the moment he'd left her house. His threat to ruin Claire's life wasn't the move of a man in control. It was the desperate lunge of a cornered animal. He had overplayed his hand, and in doing so, he had lit a fire, not just under Margaret, but under the very institution he thought he controlled. When Margaret called Mrs. Albright at the Historical Society the next morning and told her everything, the cut-break line, the break-ins, and the direct threat against her granddaughter, the polite, academic curiosity in the woman's voice was replaced by a cold, hard anger. Elliot Grant had not just intimidated a citizen, he had threatened a member of the community in his official capacity as the society's gatekeeper. He had weaponized the town's history, and for a true historian like Mrs. Albright, that was an unforgivable sin. The system that Grant had so skillfully manipulated was about to turn on him. Mrs. Albright, whose family had been in the county even longer than the Grants, began to make quiet, off-the-record calls. She spoke to a cousin on the county board, an old friend who owned a local construction company, a nephew who was a geology professor at the state university. She didn't file paperwork. She didn't ask for permits. She called in favors. She framed it not as an excavation, but as a preliminary geological survey to assess the stability of the abandoned tunnel for public safety, using Grant's own logic against him. A week later, on a cold, gray dawn, a small, unofficial crew assembled at the base of Black Ridge. There were no county vehicles, no official banners. Just a handful of volunteers, a few rugged-looking men from the construction company, the geology professor, Mrs. Albright, and Margaret and Claire. The air was thick with a nervous, electric tension, the thrill of rebellion. They were breaking the rules to uncover a truth the rules were designed to hide. Margaret's heart hammered in her chest. This felt reckless, dangerous, a point of no return. What if Grant found out? What if he showed up with the sheriff? But one look at Claire's determined face, at Mrs. Albright's resolute expression, and she knew there was no turning back. The men from the construction crew brought a small, portable jackhammer and a generator. The geology professor took core samples from the rock around the concrete seal, declaring the area surprisingly stable. Then, the jackhammer roared to life, its brutal, percussive sound echoing through the silent forest. It felt like a war cry. For hours they worked. They drilled a series of holes into the concrete, then used sledgehammers and pry bars to break away chunks of the gray slab. It was slow, back-breaking work. Margaret and Claire helped haul away the rubble, their hands raw, their faces smudged with dust. Every crack in the concrete felt like a victory. The sense of shared purpose, of a small group of ordinary people standing together against a powerful lie, was exhilarating. It was the highest emotional peak Margaret had felt yet, a pure, unadulterated moment of hope and solidarity. Late in the afternoon, one of the hammers broke through. A rush of cold, stale air, smelling of rust and damp earth and something else, something ancient and sorrowful, billowed out from the darkness within. A collective gasp went through the group. They had breached the tomb, they widened the hole, and one of the men shone a powerful flashlight into the blackness. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating a scene that had been frozen in time for 75 years. There, not more than 20 feet from the entrance, was the locomotive. It was tilted on its side, derailed, its black steel body covered in a thick shroud of rust and grime. It looked like a dead behemoth, a metal giant that had fallen in battle. A profound, reverent silence fell over the crew. They were looking at a ghost. The hole was just big enough for one person to squeeze through. One of the younger workmen, a man named Dave, volunteered to go in first. He tied a rope around his waist and, with a flashlight in hand, wriggled into the tunnel. For a tense minute, they heard only the sound of his movements, the scuff of his boots on the ballast. Then, his voice, muffled and echoing, floated back out to them. "It's all here, the whole train, it's like a museum." Margaret's heart was in her throat. She had to see. "I'm going in," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. Before anyone could object, she tied the rope around her waist and, with Claire holding her hand to steady her, she squeezed through the opening. The inside of the tunnel was cold, the air so still it felt heavy. The beam of her flashlight cut a trembling circle in the absolute darkness. The silence was overwhelming. As her eyes adjusted, the sheer scale of the scene hit her. The locomotive was massive, a hulking black shape that filled the space. Behind it, a line of freight cars stretched back into the impenetrable gloom, and then she saw the cab. The door was bent open, and her light fell upon the engineer's seat. What was left of him was still there. A skeleton, clad in the tattered remains of overalls, was slumped over the controls. One skeletonized hand rested on a lever, as if he had been trying to stop the train until the very last second, and in his other hand, clutched to his chest, was a small leather-bound book. Margaret stumbled forward, her breath catching in a sob. "Robert," she whispered, the name echoing in the dead air. She reached a trembling hand toward the book. It was a Bible. As her fingers touched the brittle leather, the book fell open. On the flyleaf, in faded but clear handwriting, was a message. "God grant me courage to finish the road." It was his handwriting. It was his final prayer. Tears streamed down Margaret's face, a mixture of profound grief and overwhelming love. She had found him. She had finally brought him home. But as her flashlight beam moved across the floor of the cab, it illuminated something else. A pile of papers, scattered and stained, but some still legible. They were official-looking documents, maintenance reports, safety inspections. Margaret picked one up. Her blood ran cold. It was a formal order to seal the tunnel, dated just 2 days after the date on the newspaper article. It described a catastrophic and unrecoverable derailment. It was a lie, written and filed before the dust had even settled, and at the bottom of the order were the signatures. A list of railroad and safety officials who had signed off on the cover-up. The names were a blur of cursive script, but the very last one, stamped in neat official ink, was perfectly clear. jjwww.com. Grant, Safety Supervisor, Elliot Grant's father. The revelation was a physical blow, so shocking it knocked the air from her lungs. This wasn't just about protecting a company. This was about protecting a family. A legacy of lies passed down from father to son. But there was more. The evidence all around them pointed to something far more sinister than a simple derailment. The way the locomotive was tilted, the damage to the tracks just inside the tunnel entrance, it looked less like an accident and more like deliberate sabotage. The train hadn't crashed, it had been wrecked, and then sealed, with Robert Callahan still inside. Just as this horrifying realization began to sink in, a shout echoed from the tunnel entrance. "Get out! Get out now! Someone's coming!" The hope, the victory, the solemn grief of the last hour, it all vanished in a tidal wave of panic. And then, another sound. The wail of a siren, growing closer. Margaret scrambled back toward the opening, her mind reeling. They had found Robert. They had found the truth. But in doing so, they had sprung the trap. The sudden glare of flashing red and blue lights filled the opening of the tunnel. Figures in uniform were swarming the site. A gruff, angry voice bellowed through a megaphone. "This is the Allegheny County Sheriff's Department. This is an unauthorized site. Everyone, drop what you are doing and step away from the tunnel. You are all under arrest." Margaret froze in the darkness of the tunnel, the damning documents in her hand, the flashing lights painting her in strobing colors of red and blue. She had just unearthed a 75-year-old murder, only to be caught in the act, her credibility about to be shattered, the evidence about to be seized and buried once more. She was no longer a truth-seeker. In the eyes of the law, she was now a criminal. The moment the sheriff's deputies swarmed the site, Margaret felt the full, crushing weight of reality. The triumphant surge of finally finding Robert, of holding his Bible, of seeing the damning evidence, it all evaporated into a suffocating cloud of dread. She was yanked from the tunnel, the maintenance reports, and the donor ledger torn from her grasp by a burly deputy. The fragile, irreplaceable artifacts of her quest were immediately bagged as evidence, vanishing behind a clear plastic barrier, out of her reach. Mrs. Albright, the geology professor, and the construction crew were all being read their rights, their faces etched with confusion and disbelief. Claire, pale but defiant, was arguing fiercely with a younger officer, trying to explain, to plead their case, but her words were dismissed, drowned out by the harsh authority of the law. Elliot Grant had played his final, devastating card. He had allowed them to do the impossible, to break open the sealed tunnel, to find the truth, only to have them arrested the moment they did. He had turned their desperate triumph into a public disgrace, leveraging the law itself to rebury the secret. The betrayal was so precise, so calculated, it took Margaret's breath away. They were all taken down to the sheriff's office. Margaret, numb with shock, sat in a sterile interrogation room, the smell of disinfectant clinging to her clothes, a stark contrast to the damp, ancient smell of the tunnel. Her protests, her explanations, her pleas about a 75-year-old murder and a systemic cover-up were met with blank stares, polite nods, and the cold, unfeeling language of official procedure. She sounded like a madwoman, an obsessed old woman, raving about ghosts and conspiracies. The deputies treated her with a patronizing patience that was worse than anger. They released them later that night, with a stern warning, no charges filed, but with every piece of evidence confiscated. Mrs. Albright, though furious, confessed that she couldn't pursue the matter further without risking her professional standing. The construction crew, under threat of legal action and lost contracts, quietly withdrew. The geology professor offered his solidarity, but admitted he had no legal leverage. The little rebellion had been brutally crushed. The next morning, the local news ran the story. It wasn't a triumphant exposé of a historical cover-up. It was a humiliating smear. Elderly woman leads archaeological dig on private property, ignoring county regulations. Her name, once synonymous with a respected teacher, was now linked to reckless disregard for the law, to irresponsible actions that put the community at risk. Elliot Grant's name, however, appeared as a quote from a concerned community elder, gravely expressing regret that such reckless endeavors were undertaken without proper procedure, posing a threat to both public safety and the preservation of our town's delicate historical integrity. His false narrative was the only one allowed to stand. He was the hero, she the delusional, dangerous fool. The phone rang constantly, but it wasn't support. It was George. His voice, when Margaret finally answered, was thick with scorn and vindication. "You made us a laughingstock, Margaret." "I told you. Now look what you've done." They've got your picture plastered on every website, talking about you like you've lost your mind. You're embarrassing this family. You're making us a target for things better left buried." His anger was a heavy blow, driving the final nail into her coffin of defeat. The emotional roller coaster of the past weeks had come to a grinding, brutal halt, leaving her broken and utterly alone. Her reputation, her dignity, her life savings, she had poured everything into this quest. And now, not only had she failed to bring justice to Robert Callahan, but she had lost everything and dragged her family name through the mud in the process. She sat in her living room, staring at the muted television screen, where her own blurred image flashed across the local news. She watched as a pundit gravely discussed the irresponsible actions of certain amateur historians, painting her as a menace, not a hero. Her shoulders slumped. Her spirit, which had been so fierce, so unyielding, finally broke. She felt a profound, suffocating sense of helplessness. It was over. She had failed Robert. She had failed Claire. Margaret prepared to give up. The vibrant fire that had once burned within her, fueled by anger and hope, had been reduced to cold ashes. She cleaned her study, packing away the remaining scraps of paper, the notes that now seemed meaningless without the key evidence. The railroad lantern, the whistle, she considered boxing them away in the attic, out of sight, out of mind. They were relics of a broken dream, symbols of her devastating loss. The humiliation and the public dismissal were worse than any jail sentence. Her spirit was crushed. She imagined retreating into herself, living out her days in quiet defeat, leaving Robert Callahan to his final solitary slumber. The emotional cost was simply too high. Then, Claire arrived. Margaret had tried to tell her not to come, but her granddaughter was already at the door, her eyes bright with a dangerous, exhilarating glint. She was not a shattered victim. She was defiant. "Grandma, get up," Claire said, her voice firm, pulling a small, discreet digital camera from her pocket. "We are not letting him win. Not now. Not ever." Margaret looked at her, her eyes weary, devoid of hope. "Claire, it's over. They took everything. They made us a joke. They ruined us." "No," Claire retorted, shaking her head vehemently. "They didn't take everything." She held up the camera. "You taught me to document everything, remember? Every single piece of evidence, every interview, every finding, even if it was just for my own safety." A slow, thrilling jolt went through Margaret. Every finding, the ledger, Robert's Bible. "When the police started swarming," Claire explained, her voice tight with suppressed excitement, "I knew what they were doing. I knew they were going to confiscate everything. So, as they were shouting before they even got to you, I took my phone out. I got pictures of every single page of the hazard bonus ledger. Every name, every refused payment. And I zoomed in on Elliot Grant's father's signature on the tunnel order. And then I took pictures of Uncle Robert's Bible. Every word on that flyleaf. God grant me courage to finish the road. All of it, Grandma. It's all here, digitally preserved. They can't confiscate what they don't know exists." The truth, which had felt utterly extinguished, flared back to life, blazing hotter and brighter than ever. Claire's defiance, her quick thinking, her unwavering loyalty, it was an anchor in the storm of Margaret's despair. She hadn't made a mistake putting Claire in danger. She had awakened her to justice. The shame and humiliation of the past few days were instantly replaced by a surging tide of hope and immense pride. This wasn't just a new piece of evidence. This was the key. This was everything. Elliot Grant thought he had crushed them. He thought he had sealed his victory. He thought he had buried the truth. But he had forgotten one crucial detail. He hadn't counted on a tenacious retired teacher and a brilliant, quick-witted granddaughter who knew how to use her phone. And he certainly hadn't accounted for the indelible legacy of Robert Callahan's courage, captured in a photograph. The battle was far from over. It had just found its unexpected weapon. The photographs Claire had taken were more than just images. They were ghosts. Ghosts of a truth that Elliot Grant had tried to murder twice, once in 1944 and again just days ago. Staring at the crisp, clear pictures on Claire's laptop, Margaret felt a resolve hardening in her bones, a cold, diamond-hard fury that had been tempered in the fires of humiliation and despair. She now had the weapons. All she needed was the right battlefield. The upcoming monthly town hall meeting was that battlefield. It was a place of civic order, a forum Grant respected and likely felt he controlled. It was the perfect stage for his public execution. For the next 3 days, Margaret and Claire worked with the meticulous precision of battlefield commanders. They printed the photographs on high-quality paper, creating physical copies that felt as real and undeniable as the original documents. They prepared a simple, direct presentation, a narrative so clear and compelling that no one could deny its power. This was Margaret's final, most desperate gamble. She was betting everything on the conscience of her community. She was betting that even in a town that prized order, the truth, once revealed, would be too monstrous to ignore. The night of the town hall, the atmosphere in the municipal building was stuffy and routine. The agenda was filled with the usual small-town concerns: zoning disputes, funding for the annual fall festival, complaints about potholes. Margaret sat in the audience with Claire, her heart a frantic, trapped bird in her chest. She saw Elliot Grant near the front, seated amongst the town council members, the very picture of civic virtue and authority. He caught her eye once and gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a final, silent warning. It was the condescending gesture of a man who believed he had already won. When the floor was opened for public comment, Margaret walked to the podium. A low murmur rippled through the room. After the recent news coverage, her presence was a minor scandal. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, a mixture of pity, curiosity, and contempt. She could feel Grant's icy stare boring into her back. "Good evening," she began, her voice shaking slightly but clear. "My name is Margaret Hensley, and I am here tonight to finish a story." She didn't speak of conspiracies or murders. She started with a photograph, projected onto the large screen behind her. It was a picture of a young, handsome man in an engineer's cap, Robert Callahan. "This was my great-uncle," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, profound grief. "And for 75 years, my family was told he died a hero in the war. That was a lie." She then took them, step by step, through the story, not as an accuser, but as a teacher. The lantern, the newspaper article, the sealed tunnel. With each revelation, the atmosphere in the room began to change. The board shuffling and quiet coughs ceased. People leaned forward. The story was taking hold. Then, she put up the first of Claire's photographs. The hazard bonus ledger, the names, the payoffs. She pointed to her uncle's name. "This is the company's own ledger of bribes paid to engineers to run unsafe trains during the war," she said, her voice ringing with indignation. "And this is what my uncle Robert Callahan wrote next to his name: refused payment." A gasp went through the crowd. This was not the act of a traitor, this was the act of a hero. The narrative Grant and the news had so carefully constructed began to crumble. Next, she showed the picture of the tunnel sealing order, dated just 2 days after the accident. This order was to seal the tunnel, burying the evidence of what the company had done. The man they called a traitor was, in fact, a whistleblower, and they silenced him. And then, she delivered the killing blow. She zoomed in on the signature at the bottom of the order. J. Grant, Safety Supervisor. The name filled the screen, large and undeniable. "This was a family secret," she said, her voice dropping, filled with a righteous fury. "A legacy of lies, passed down from father to son." Finally she turned, her eyes locking with Elliot Grant's across the room. "Mr. Grant," she said, her voice no longer shaking but resonating with the full weight of the truth. "You told me that your creed was order before truth. But this wasn't order. This was a cover-up to protect your family's name, the company's profits, and the war effort. You let an innocent man's reputation be destroyed, and you let his family believe a lie for 3/4 of a century." Every eye in the room swiveled to Elliot Grant. His face, which had been a mask of calm authority, was now ashen. The confident posture was gone. He looked trapped, exposed under the harsh lights of the auditorium. The silence was absolute, thick with a collective sense of shock and betrayal. Someone in the crowd, the old veteran from the library, stood up. "Is this true, Elliot?" he called out, his voice raspy but strong. "Did your father do this?" Grant rose to his feet, his hands gripping the back of the chair in front of him. He opened his mouth, but for a moment, no sound came out. Then, the words tumbled out, not in a calm denial, but in a torrent of defensive rage. "You people don't understand," he spat, his carefully constructed composure shattering. "It was wartime. We had a duty. To the country, to this town. The jobs, the morale, everything depended on those trains running. My father made a hard choice to protect this community." The confession, twisted as it was, hung in the air. He wasn't denying it, he was justifying it. Then he turned his venom on Margaret. The mask of the respected elder fell away completely, revealing the sneering, entitled face of a man whose power had been challenged. "Your uncle chose pride over duty," he sneered, his voice dripping with a lifetime of pent-up contempt. "He wanted to be a hero, he got what he asked for." It was a fatal misstep. The sheer, hateful cruelty of that statement, the utter lack of remorse, turned the tide completely. A low rumble of outrage began in the back of the room. It started as whispers, "He admits it, my God," buried him alive, and swelled into a wave of collective anger. People were on their feet, shouting questions, pointing at Grant. The mayor, who had been sitting in stunned silence, began banging his gavel, calling for order, but it was useless. The order that Elliott Grant had so cherished, the order he had killed to maintain, had just been destroyed by the one thing he could no longer control, the truth. In the chaos, Margaret stood at the podium, tears streaming down her face. But these were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of relief, of vindication. She had done it. She had brought Robert's story into the light. The public outcry was immediate and overwhelming. The sheriff, who had so dismissively handled her case before, now had no choice but to launch a full-scale investigation in the face of immense public pressure. The story was picked up by state and then national news. Elliott Grant was suspended from his position at the Historical Society, his name now a synonym for shame and deceit. With official sanction, the tunnel was finally, properly, excavated. The scene inside was just as Margaret had described, a tomb frozen in time. Robert Callahan's remains were carefully recovered, along with his Bible, the scattered maintenance reports, and the damning evidence of sabotage. The truth was no longer just Margaret's story, it was a matter of public record. A few weeks later, on a crisp, cold morning, a funeral was held. Not a quiet family affair, but a large public service. Robert Callahan, the man once branded a traitor, was given a full military funeral with honors, recognized for his courage and sacrifice. The coffin, draped in an American flag, was carried by an honor guard. The sharp crack of a rifle salute echoed through the cemetery, a sound of justice finally delivered. Margaret stood at the graveside, clutching the old railroad lantern, the one that had started it all. She wept as the flag was folded and presented to her, her tears finally washing away the grief and the anger of a lifetime. The cost of this victory was etched on the faces around her. Her brother, George, was not there. The chasm between them had become too wide to cross. He could not bring himself to admit he had been wrong, that the comfortable peace he cherished had been built on a terrible lie. The family was fractured, perhaps permanently, but as she looked around, she saw her community, the old veteran, Mrs. Albright, the men from the construction crew, dozens of townspeople who had been moved by Robert's story. They had become a different kind of family, one forged not by blood, but by a shared belief in the truth. Claire stood beside her, her hand resting on Margaret's shoulder. "We'll keep his story alive, Grandma," she promised, her voice thick with emotion. "Truth doesn't die. Not anymore." The justice was real, but it was bittersweet. A good man's life had been stolen. A family had been torn apart. The stain of the cover-up would linger on the town's history forever. But as Margaret placed the old, rusted lantern on Robert's new headstone, its metal glowing softly in the autumn light, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The light, which had been hidden in darkness for 75 years, was finally free, and it was shining.